In this lecture, we will look at how to create form elements in HTML. In websites, often we need to use forms to get user input. Some of the common elements used in a form are label, text box, button, checkbox, radio buttons, drop down, date picker, color picker, and field set. These are some common controls that we often use in a form. So we will see how to create each of these elements using HTML. First, we look at text box control. So to create a text box, we use input tag. I am in line number 15. So the syntax is input type is equal to text. And we have ID attribute. So let me give some name. We'll come to each attribute. We'll see what is the purpose of each attribute now. So next we have placeholder attribute. Here input type attribute equal to text. And we are using ID attribute to change the text box style using CSS. Let's check the output. So let me save this and go to the output. We have a text box equal to enter first name. What is that? So here, if I delete this equal to, then it will be right. See, we have a text box with something. This is called as placeholder. So if I start typing in this, the placeholder text will disappear. So that is called as placeholder. Placeholder attribute indicates the user what needs to be entered in the text box. To create a password text box, type should be given as password instead of text. So let's try. I'm just copying the same line, and here instead of text, we are going to enter password. And ID is going to be a different name, password, and placeholder, I'm going to enter text as enter password. Okay, save and go to the output. So if I enter text here, I am typing test, T-E-S-T. You can see dots, right? So in the output we see dots if the user types anything in the password text box. That is because here input type is given as password in line number 16. Next, we look at label element. To create label, we use label tag. Usually we create label for text box, drop down or form elements. For example, we can have label enter name, and we can have a text box right next to it. So in this case, label and text box are associated. Do you understand what I am saying here? We have a text box first name, right? So here before this text box, we have to create a label, and that label should be associated with this text box. So first let's create a label. So we use label tag, and we have an attribute for is equal to within quotes. So I am entering a value. So we'll come to that. So what is that value? What value needs to be entered here? We'll come to that shortly. Sorry. Here in line number 15, we have a label tag and for attribute. We use for attribute to associate the label tag with the corresponding text box to whichever we want to associate. So we use for attribute to connect label with the text box. Here first name, the value of the for attribute, first name is the ID of this text box. Did you see this text box, first name? So the ID of this text box is entered as a value in the for attribute of this label. So now this text box and the label are linked. Okay, let's check the output. Let me save this. So we have a label and a text box next to it. When I click on this label now, the text box will get highlighted. See, When I click on this label, the text box will get highlighted. See, we have a cursor inside the text box when I click on label. So let me refresh again. So we don't have any cursor inside the text box, inside the first check box. I am going to click on the label now. Now you see there is a cursor inside the text box. So this is how we associate a label with the text box using for attribute for label tag. Next we will see radio buttons. Radio buttons are often used in quizzes, exams to choose multiple choice answers. Only one option can be selected at a time from a radio button group, right? So to create radio button, we use input tag and type attribute should be radio. And then similarly we'll give some ID, and there is also another attribute called name that is important for radio buttons. So let's create that so that we'll understand easily. So as I told you, so we use input attribute and type is equal to, within quotes we have to write radio, and then we have ID attribute, and in that ID attribute I'm going to give some name, and then here comes name attribute. We have name attribute here. We'll see the purpose of name attribute shortly. So I'm going to give some name, my radio. So we'll copy and paste this to create multiple radio buttons. So I'm going to create 3 radio buttons. Radio button 1, 2 and 3. So what is the purpose of name attribute here? All the radio button with the same name will be considered as one single group. So we know what is the radio button, right? If we have 3 radio buttons, only one can be selected at a time, right? So all these 3 radio buttons here are given same name, my radio, so that these 3 radio buttons belong to one single group and only one radio button can be selected at a time. So name attribute is important with the radio button for grouping. Okay, so now let's check the output. We just have radio button. See, like when I click on a radio button, only one is selected at a time. That is good. But we don't see any text next to radio button, because if we want some text next to radio button, then we have to use label tag and associate the radio button with the label. We'll see that. See here, next to each radio button, I'm going to use label tag, label. So for is equal to, what is the ID of this radio button? Radio button 1. So I am associating first radio button with this first label by using this for attribute. Radio button 1 and name is, so I'll give T, and then similarly I'm going to copy this, and for the second one, second radio button should be associated with second label. So these two, this radio button and this label is linked, and I'm going to enter something like coffee and then paste radio button 3 and then milk. So save this, refresh. Now when I click on a label, the corresponding radio button will get automatically selected, because there is an association between label and radio button. There is also another important attribute for radio buttons, that is value attribute. Not only radio button, all the form elements has value attribute, but for some form elements the value attribute will be hidden, and whatever value that we enter will be assigned to the value attribute. For example, if we take a text box, whatever value we type in the text box, whatever name we type in the first name text box here in line number 16, so that name will be assigned to the hidden value attribute, and whatever password we type in this password text box, that will be assigned to the hidden value attribute. But for radio buttons, we have to explicitly give the value attribute and set some value, so that if we check any radio button, the corresponding value assigned to the radio button will be taken. So we'll see this with an example. Here I'm going to use value. So I'm intentionally giving value as red for explaining purpose. So I'm going to give value as red, blue and green. Here there are 3 radio buttons, and all like this radio button label is T, but its value is red. Here the radio button label is coffee, its value is blue. So what I am trying to convey here is, irrespective of whatever the label text is, when you select a radio button, the text in the value attribute, that will be actually sent to the server. That is, if we have a form, usually there are server side languages like PHP, Python. So usually client languages like CSS, JavaScript, that will be interacting with server side languages if we want to create a full-fledged website. So we are not going into server languages more depth now. Just to give you an idea, I am telling you this. If we select a radio button, whatever value that is, whatever text that is given in the value attribute, that will be submitted to the server. Here in this case, if I click on this coffee radio button, the text given in the value attribute, which is blue, that will be taken as actual value and that will be sent to the server. And because of that, value attribute is important. So we have to make sure correct value is entered in the value attribute. Okay. Next is checkbox. We create checkbox using input tag, and type attribute value has to be checkbox. What's the difference between a checkbox and a radio button? So the difference between checkbox and radio button is that in checkbox, multiple values can be checked at a time. So we will create 3 checkbox now. So here we have 3 checkbox, and each checkbox is associated with the label. And the label text is different from value attribute text. So as we saw on the radio buttons before, because the value attribute, the text in the value attribute, that will be the actual value and not the label text. So let's save this and go to the output. So we have 3 checkbox here, and I'm going to check all the 3 checkbox. We are able to check all the checkboxes because the checkbox is different from radio button in the sense, or we can select multiple items in the same time. Next we will see drop down. So we use select tag to create drop down. I'm in line number 26 and I'm going to give ID attribute to style the element using CSS. ID is equal to some name, my drop down. And inside select tag we use option tag to create drop down options. Okay, here also we have value attribute. So we can use value attribute here, and the value given in the value attribute, that is the actual value, and usually the value given in the value attribute and the text entered in the drop down text will be same. It should be same. So just for understanding purpose, I am giving a different value here so that we know that the value given in the value attribute, that is the actual value that will be sent to the server. So here, even if I give value is equal to green and drop down text is drop down 1, value green is the actual value, and when this drop down 1 option is selected, value green will be sent to the server. So now when I select drop down 3 option, value brown will be sent to the server. So next element is date picker. I am in line number 34. Often we need to use date picker to get date input from the user, like date of birth or appointment date. So date picker control is very handy and easy to use for this purpose. To create date picker control, we have to use input tag with type attribute set to date. So we use minimum attribute to set the starting date. Here note that the format given for date is year, month and date. So let's check the output, save and check the output. See, we have the date picker control here and we can select the needed date. The selected date appears in the date picker control. Next we look at color picker control. Color picker control, it's not very common element. It's not a very common form element, but it will be useful in case of paint business or wherever you have to get some color options from the user. To create color picker control, we use input tag with type set to color. Save and we'll check the output. So I have a color picker control here. So I can choose whatever color I want, and you can see the RGB code here and hexa code is also here. So the selected color will appear in the color picker control. So in the color picker control, we can also use ID attribute to style it using CSS, and also you can have a label next to it and associate this control with the label using for attribute. Next is submit button. Submit button is for submitting the form. So to create submit button, we have to use input tag with type set to submit. And we have another attribute called value, and here the text entered in the value attribute is the text that will appear in the button as the button name. And we have our submit button here. And next is the reset button. Reset button is quite useful and handy to reset the form value. So for example, if you have a form with many fields, and if you want to reset, if you have a reset button, then it will be easy to erase all the form data at once by clicking on a button rather than going and deleting everything. So for that purpose, reset button will be useful. To create a reset button, we have to use input tag, and type has to be set to reset. And here also we have value attribute, and whatever text you type in the value attribute, that text will appear as the button name. So I'm giving it as reset button. Here is the output. We have our reset button here next to submit button. So next is text area control. What is text area? We use text area to make the user enter their comments to get multiple lines of input from the user. Okay, so we use text area tag to create a text area control, and we use rows and columns attribute to create to specify the number of rows and columns that needs to be present in the text area. So I'm going to create a text area by using text area tag. Okay. In line number 43, here is the syntax for creating a text area. We have text area tag, and then rows attribute set to 10 and columns attribute set to 30. So we have 10 rows and 30 columns spacing for the text area. And we have a placeholder attribute with some text. Oh, sorry, I have to close the text area tag. So now, yeah, we have the text area with some placeholder text. Enter some text. So last one we are going to look at is field set control. What is a field set control? It is just for grouping and naming. Grouping some controls and naming it as personal info so that the user understands that personal details has to be entered in this area. Okay, we'll see that with an example. So we use field set tag, and inside field set we use a tag called legend, and that inside the legend we have to give the title for the field set. Okay, here I close the field set. Just below the legend is the title for the block. What is the title? For example, I am going to capture all the personal details of the user, then I will give personal info as the title of the block. And below this legend tag, we have to include all our controls. That is, we have to create all the controls inside the field set after legend. That is, all the controls has to be in between the opening and closing of the field set tag and below the legend tag. So we can create text box, buttons, radio buttons, drop down, whatever you want. So let me just copy and paste all these things inside this legend tag. That is inside the field set tag below the legend tag. And also indent it a bit. Okay. So now all the controls placed inside the field set tag will be kind of grouped as personal info. So you can see in the output, right? So here personal info is the title given, and we have some controls inside the field set tag. So in this lecture we learned about all the HTML form elements, right? We saw about text box, radio buttons, checkbox, drop down, color picker, date picker, text area control, buttons. So all the HTML form elements, we learned how to create all those. In the next lecture, we'll create a web page, a survey form web page project using the concepts that we have learned so far. especially using the HTML elements, HTML form elements that we have learned in this lecture, and also using some CSS properties that we have learned in the previous lecture. Thank you for watching.